Earlier this week, Secretary of State Marco Rubio testified before a Senate committee talking about the situation with Venezuela after U.S. strikes detained and captured ousted President Nicolás Maduro. And we are learning now that just this weekend, as we take a look at this, a social media post from Reuters, the top U.S. envoy for Venezuela has arrived in Caracas. She did so just yesterday on Saturday. She's there to reopen the American diplomatic mission in Venezuela after 7 years of severed ties. The move comes almost 1 month after that military action ordered by President Trump. Venezuela and the United States broke off diplomatic relations in February of 2019 in a decision made by Maduro. Joining us now to talk about all the latest as we track these developments in Venezuela is Jason Marzak. He is the Vice President and Senior Director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Jason, good to have you.
Good morning, Corral. Great to be on the show.
All right, so let's just start with that. The breaking news from this weekend. We have a U.S. envoy there in Venezuela. Can you really explain to our viewers how big of a deal this is, and where does this make us stand, or where do we stand, I should say better, when it comes to these relationships and the development between the U.S. and Venezuela?
Well, Corral, it's a big deal that Ambassador Dogu is there. And I've actually had the pleasure of working with her when she served in previous posts across the region. And she's a highly competent ambassador. She's going there as leading what's called the Venezuela Affairs Unit that's based out of the U.S. Embassy in Bogota, which is essentially the way that we've been conducting relations in Venezuela since 2019 when our embassy was closed. So the fact that she arrived just yesterday in Venezuela, this is all part of the U.S. effort to not only reestablish the embassy, but also know firsthand what's happening on the ground, because without an ambassador, without an embassy team there, it's very difficult to know exactly what Delcy Rodriguez and others are doing to be in compliance, or where they're not being so forthright with the interests put forward by President Trump and the administration.
Speaking of Delcy Rodriguez, that's where I want to turn to next. She is the interim and acting president there in Venezuela. Putting up here some footage of her so our viewers can see. Now, a couple of decisions made by Delcy and her cabinet members and the government this week, and we know that Venezuela and the U.S., they seem to be working together. That's according to the Venezuelan government, also the U.S. officials. But Rodriguez on Friday announced an amnesty bill that could lead to the release of hundreds of prisoners, including opposition leaders, journalists, and human rights activists that were detained for political reasons. Let's dive into this a little bit more. Now, Jason, could releasing these political prisoners really reshape Venezuelan politics, and how quickly could that change come?
Well, this is a really big deal, the amnesty bill. And I also, Carl, want to take us back. It's been less than a month since President Trump authorized U.S. Special Forces to go in and remove Nicolás Maduro. So I just want to contextualize for the viewers how much has been achieved in less than a month with regard to Venezuela after years and years of paralysis. Now, the amnesty bill that Delcy Rodriguez put forward is very important. Under Chavez and especially under Maduro, Venezuela has systematically locked up not only opposition leaders, but anybody who would show political dissent toward the Venezuelan government. Those people are housed in different facilities, but one of the most notorious facilities is called El Helicoide, which is a prison and detention center, and actually known as a torture center as well. So in addition to that bill, it was also announced that that prison, this notorious, horrific prison, will also be shut down, which is a really big deal. Now, the key is that other torture centers are not open, and also with regard to the amnesty, that not only is it verified that all political prisoners are released, but that new political prisoners are not rounded up. And we've seen releases of political prisoners over the past in Venezuela, and then new ones rounded up. However, I think this is a very different moment. These actions are being taken because Delcy Rodriguez knows that if they're not taken, that she now has to answer to the United States.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because that segues us into our next question. I want to talk about a statement released by opposition leader Maria Corina Machado regarding this situation. Now, she is in Washington, D.C. This is some footage from, the last several days as she meets with lawmakers in the U.S. and D.C. So Machado, in a statement, said this, that the actions were not taken, quote, voluntarily, but rather in response to pressure from the U.S. government. But When we talk about this and we talk about this amnesty law as that genuine reform or possibly that response to the U.S. pressure, does that really matter in terms of the possible effects that it'll have?
Yeah, I think the U.S. pressure does matter. President Trump's was very forthright a few weeks ago and said that if the Venezuelans didn't comply, that there was a potential second attack. And they know, the Venezuelans know very well the military assets that we have just off their shores. And they know the strength of the U.S. military. At the same time, in some ways, it's these reforms are actually beneficial to Delcy Rodriguez and the acting government there as well, because the Venezuelan economy has been in a free fall for numbers of years. And so the fact that what we're doing as part of this is, as Secretary Rubio outlined, the three-phase plan of stability, recovery, and transition. This stability phase is so important for Venezuela, the Venezuelan government as well, so that they can bring in some of the much needed economic investment into the country. Venezuela has been subject to U.S. sanctions for a number of years. Those sanctions are being removed. There was a general license granted just this past week as well. So there's the actions taken by the U.S. and the pressure being put on Venezuela is also going to hopefully be able to revive the Venezuelan economy, which can then also be part of a precursor to what's eventually needed, which is a transition to democracy.
And that's where I want to go on next, because earlier this week, Delcy Rodriguez also opening up the oil industry there in Venezuela to the private sector. So if you can just dive in a little bit more about how this would impact Venezuelan economy in the short term, possibly in the long term, but also are foreign companies likely to go back to the Latin American country given the history of nationalization?
Yeah, so Venezuela's has the world's largest proven oil reserves. So it's a big deal. Venezuela used to produce 20, 30 years ago over 3 million barrels per day of oil. It's now down to around a million barrels per day. So there's a lot of potential in the Venezuelan oil sector. However, major oil companies have left Venezuela over the years, begin dating back to the nationalizations. Actually, first nationalizations were even before Chavez, but another round in the late 2000s under Hugo Chavez. And so there's a lot of apprehension about from oil companies to invest in Venezuela. But this new law allows for foreign oil companies to have authority over their own production, which is really important. Also caps royalty rates and removes PDVSA from always having to have operational control, PDVSA being the Venezuelan state oil company. So it provides a lot of important incentives for U.S. companies and for other Western companies to invest in Venezuela. The question is going to be, what is the long-term situation on the ground, and is there that stability for that investment over the years it takes to revive the industry? Because a lot of the infrastructure needs to be severely updated, if not just torn down and rebuilt.
I think that brings us back to this testimony that we had from Secretary Rubio on Capitol Hill earlier this week. Obviously, the focus on that was Venezuela and also this operation to capture Maduro, but what's going to be happening to those oil reserves? The U.S. is going to have heavy involvement in that, and that's according to Secretary Rubio. How is that going to affect Venezuelan sovereignty? And if you could just briefly break down really what the U.S. is going to be doing there when it comes to that oil revenue.
Yeah, so that one of the big concerns is that oil revenue that just goes into the hands of the Venezuelan government and doesn't actually reach the Venezuelan people, and that revenue is used for illegal purposes. It's used for enriching just those close to the government to keep them loyal. And so, what is happening as part of the U.S. agreement with Venezuela is that the oil that's being sold, that the U.S. has some control over the financial channels in which that oil is then being the oil revenue is then being retransmitted into Venezuela, and that as part of that, that there is an assurance that the money that's gained as part of that revenue actually goes back to the Venezuelan people, and it's not used to solely just to enrich the Venezuelan government and for corruption purposes. So that's going to be really important. Now, it's going to be key to see that the devil is, of course, in the details to make sure that that the systems that are set up in Venezuela do actually realize the goal. that President Trump and the administration have put forward.
We've talked about a lot of changes that have happened within Venezuela, basically in just about a month's time, Jason. I mean, that's what we started this conversation with, is how much has gone down when we're talking about years and years of no change and a lot of political instability. But moving forward, is this change going to be beneficial? Well, it may, of course, if it all goes well. But what other kind of political pressures are there that probably are a bit deeper than just what's being happening now?
Yeah, I think, Corral, this first, it's just to take us back. It's impressive what's been achieved in just less than a month. This is warp speed with which Venezuela is changing. Right, we're still in this initial stability phase. What needs to be done? There needs to be, first off, the judiciary. The judiciary has been completely co-opted over the years by Chavez, by Maduro. Judges are not independent. We need an independent judiciary. And that's important for investment as well, so that rulings and any disputes in the courts are fairly resolved. We also go back to the administration's initial goal. We need to make sure that the illegal criminal groups that are in Venezuela are fully dislodged. There's groups like the FARC, the ELN. These are groups that originally began in Colombia that are in Venezuela. We need to are disbanded, are out of Venezuela, that any criminal cartels are out of the country, as well as there's these colectivos, these groups of vigilantes essentially that are aligned with the government, and they go around and terrorize people. These groups are dismantled. So we need to really tackle the fundamentals of the security situation. I know that the president and the administration are focused on that, and that's going to be a long-term issue. President Trump is meeting with Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, this coming week. It's going to be important that the Colombians offer help to the United States to help to further improve the situation in Venezuela, given the fact that they share a border. I talked about the independence of the courts, and we eventually need the parameters so that we can actually have a free and fair election, so that Venezuelans can rightfully choose their own leader.
And then I'm going to end our conversation with just that topic, because we need to talk about Maria Corina Machado. Delcy Rodriguez right now working closely with the U.S. to make these changes. But what is going on in terms of the opposition who did win that last election? What do we know in terms of how that's looking going forward? Is Maria Corina going to be able to go to Venezuela anytime soon? I mean, what's the process there looking like?
Yeah, I think it's really important that Maria Corina and has the opportunity to return back to Venezuela, and when she does so, that she has the freedom to be able to walk the streets, doesn't have to worry about being locked up. When she was in Venezuela beforehand, she was essentially talking to the international community from different hidden locations within the country. So not only coming back to Venezuela, but also the opportunity to walk out in the streets and to freely campaign, to freely protest if need be. And so that is important, and then also for the opposition, having that timeline of to get to those free and fair elections, right? Because of course, her and Edmundo Gonzalez, as the voting tally sheets that were publicly put out, won that July 2024 election. I know. I had the opportunity to speak with Maria Corina a couple weeks ago when she was here in Washington. I know that she's optimistic about the future and optimistic about what an eventual transition to democracy can be, and also thankful for the efforts that President Trump and the administration have taken.
Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course. We're going to step away for a quick commercial break, but we have more of your top stories next.